Uh, our keynote speaker today is somebody who's very, 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 very special to me. I've known her since I was 18 years old, and she was 18 years old. So the problem is I know where all the bodies are buried. So instead, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monisha Bajaj, who I've also known for a long time and needs no introduction in this space. Dr. Bajaj, Monisha, is somebody that we all have learned from, grown from, watched her career go into so many interesting and important spaces. But the funny thing is that when I posted that Anasuya Sengupta was coming, she wrote to me and said, I know her too. And so that reminds us how small the world is. But Monisha Bajaj herself is a professor of international and multicultural education at the University of San Francisco. She is somebody who is incredibly well-written. She is incredibly passionate about the work that she does. And she is one of those scholars who teaches and shares generously of her knowledge. And so we are delighted to have her come up and introduce our keynote speaker today.
Is it on? Good afternoon, everyone. Isn't this an amazing conference that Supriya has organized? Can we give her a round of applause? 3 years after San Francisco, and we get such an amazing conference. Thank you, Supriya. And thanks for inviting me for this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker today. I was delighted to learn a few months ago that Anasuya Sengupta would be joining us at the Comparative and International Education Society 2022 annual meetings, as I know her perspectives and insights will deeply enrich the conversations being held here. Anasuya is a feminist advocate, a strategist, a grant maker, and a storyteller for communities and organizations, and has led initiatives in the US, India, and elsewhere in the Global South for more than 2 decades. In her own words, Anasuya seeks to, quote, amplify voices from the margins in both physical and virtual worlds while unpacking issues of power, privilege, and access. Anasuya is co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge, a global, multilingual, anti-colonial, feminist campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities online. She is the former Chief Grant-Making Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, the former Regional Program Director at the Global Fund for Women, and formerly served on the Board of Directors of the nonprofit Quarterly. Anasuya is a 2017 Shuttleworth Foundation Fellow and received the 2018 Internet and Society Award from the Oxford Internet Institute. And she's also on the advisory committee for MIT's Center for Research on Equitable and Open Scholarship. Anasuya holds an MPhil in Development Studies from the University of Oxford, where she studied as a Rhodes Scholar. She also has a BA in Economics from the prestigious Lady Shri Ram College at Delhi University. Anasuya identifies herself as a rabble-rouser, and a few additional R's come to mind when describing her. One is the word reimagine. Time is too short for me to share the myriad initiatives and campaigns she has led. However, I want to note that she has the capacity to envision strategies for social change, as well as outcomes from campaigns and coalitions beyond what we've seen in the past. Whether launching an online effort to correct the skewed representations of knowledge on the internet, or designing and leading a UNICEF partnership with the Karnataka police on responding to violence against women and children, Anasuya thinks outside of any existing boxes to imagine futures that are more just, equitable, and representative. Other R's that come to mind are righteous and rebellious. She consistently and persistently advances justice through her work and is never one to shy away from complex power dynamics. I recall getting to know Anasuya through a diverse coalition she helped spearhead to counter efforts by Hindu right-wing fundamentalists in the diaspora to erase mentions of caste and gender inequality and to distort Islamic and Sikh histories in California's state textbooks. Our coalition was outfunded, outnumbered, yet she skillfully brought together activists, educators, parents, community members, and others to speak truth to power and demand that accurate histories be taught to children. Anasuya has also sought to bring stories of activism into the academy, notably through a groundbreaking anthology that she co-edited entitled Defending Our Dreams, Global Feminist Voices for a New Generation, published by the Association of Women in Development and Zed Books. Anasuya and I have a common colleague who is dear to both of us, who is a queer human rights activist whose work has been targeted by her country's authoritarian regime. This activist's life, safety, and security has been threatened on multiple occasions. And she shared the following quote: Anasuya is the go-to for so many women like me who needed her to come in and diplomatically champion our voices so we can get the results we want and deserve. Anasuya thinks collaboratively, creatively, and collectively to lift up the voices of others and to increase the volume for those marginalized voices to be heard, whether by donors, by governments, or within the academy. It's my great privilege to welcome Anasuya Sengupta on behalf of the CIES community to offer her keynote today on themes of decolonizing knowledge and how the internet may serve as a site for shared liberation.
It's very hard to speak after you've been introduced by a friend and introduced in a way where you don't recognize yourself. And also you're moved to tears. So I will try and bring myself back together again. And I'm standing here before you and those online with so much gratitude, both for the deep friendships from Supriya and with Monisha, knowing where the bodies are buried, knowing where the struggles have been, and also, of course, on this land, and wanting to be in gratitude to all the living beings on this land, to this region known as Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the skies. And I thank the Dakota and the Anishinaabe for having us as guests on this land today with such generosity, knowing how brutal settler colonialism has been to them and for them. As the wise elders have already taught us at this conference a couple of days ago, this is a land of great power and of great pain. And as the wise young ones showed us yesterday through their song and their poetry, it is also a land of great power and great possibility. So thank you for having me. I also want to, because Monisha brought this up, I want to stand here in gratitude to all the Dalit feminist activists and organizers who helped anchor the struggle that we were in California around textbooks. And we can talk about that at the end of this presentation I make to you because it's so relevant to all of you. But I particularly want to do this today because it is Dalit History Month. Dalits are those formally and pejoratively known as untouchable in the caste system of India, which is probably the oldest living social structure of oppression in the world after patriarchy and alongside patriarchy. And Tenmuri Soundararajan and her team at Equality Labs were the anchors for us in this struggle to make sure that our textbooks in the United States, especially in California, are just and equitable to all of us across South Asia and here in the United States. So just to acknowledge once again the gratitude I have for so many different people who are with me as I stand with you here today. And because the young, wise singers of yesterday brought so much poetry into the room, I wanted to bring a little bit from a land of my own and share it with you. Betteda mele onda manaya maadi mrigugala ganjidal anteyya. Betteda mele ondu manaya maadi mrigugala ganjidolanteyya. Well, Akkamadevi is a 12th century mystic philosopher poet from Karnataka, the land where I grew up. She asks us, afraid of animals when your house is on the mountain, afraid of tides and living on the seashore, your house is in the marketplace, and noise deafens you. If I'm born to this world, my lord, Chenamalkarjuna, no praise, no blame, no love, no hate shall upset my calm. Akka means elder sister in Kannada, one of the languages that Supriya and I share. And she spoke over 400 vachanas, or sayings, in her lifetime, challenging both the caste system and patriarchy, two of the oldest forms of social oppression in the world. Do you need? Oh, audio's off. My friend Robert will help in the corner. I think audio's gone off. Shall I try again? I'm going to be talking about tech, so this is perfect. We're just in the midst of messy practice right here, right now. I can move to the handheld if you want me to. Try again. I think we're back. Excellent. Well, with the blessings of Akka, I will continue. Akka means elder sister in Kannada, as I said, one of the languages that Supriya and I share. And she spoke over 400 vachanas, or literally sayings, in her lifetime, challenging both the caste system and patriarchy. She was a teacher of fierce power and passion. And really, what more can any teacher want that their teaching survive through oral transmission over 900 years, and are heard today in this room, 14,000 kilometers from where she was born. May we all be tiny slivers of possibility from Akka's power. I want to also bring Akka into the room because, as I said, I grew up in the land where she was born, where the boulders meet the skies, the Deccan Plateau of North Karnataka. And I come to you inspired by Akka, recognizing that I embody, as we all do, simultaneously multiple selves, and we occupy multiple positions. I'm simultaneously both oppressor and oppressed. When I talk about tech in the Bay Area, I'm often one of the few Black and brown women in the conversation, normally one of the only ones from the Global South. When I talk about knowledge in Bangalore, my home city, I'm often one of the many Savarna, or so-called upper caste women, who inhabit the horrific social structure of pollution and purity that is the caste system. We all occupy these multiple positions, and I come to you with the humility and the vulnerability that that multiplicity brings us, and I will hope to unpack that a little bit together with you today. So, it is our dreams that point the way to freedom. And for those of you who recognize that, that is our ancestor, Audre Lorde. And I want to remind you that one of the things Audre Lorde did is to tell us that idealism does not and cannot mean forgetting. In fact, it means just the opposite. It means that we need to remember with as much power, with as much intention, and with as much care as we possibly can, so that our shared histories of oppression can help us create shared futures of justice and liberation through messy, messy practice. So today, I'm really going to anchor my conversational journey with you in 4 ancestors who have made my life and the work we do at Whose Knowledge so rich, so powerful, and I think we share many of these ancestors together. Some of them you may not know, and I will introduce you to them. Some of them you probably know very, very well. I do not know if these 4 women, Akka Mahadevi, Savitribai Phule, Audre Lorde, and bell hooks, have ever been in conversation together publicly before, but I can tell you they jostle in my mind a lot. So I want to remind us that through them and through the many people that I have been inspired by, living and past, I and all of us together are seeking a pluribus of many ways of knowing, doing, and being, the future in which many worlds coexist, as the Zapatistas suggest. So the 4 ideas that I'm holding and anchoring the conversation in are resistance, liberation, imagination, and love. And these 4 women, unsurprisingly, are women, Black and brown, warriors, revolutionary teachers, and they're all poets. And I want to just remind us again, because we've been in this space of trying to find our way through idealism and cynicism on that continuum, being uncertain, because it is an uncertain place, it's an uncertain time, it's a difficult time and place, that the only way that I feel, that we feel at Whose Knowledge, that we can bring idea and idealisms to fruit, to have hope and joy, is in the complex way of practice, with ourselves and with each other. Practice is messy, it's flawed, but it's also where intention meets honesty. And it's in the collective practice, that we also get joy. More on that soon. But now, I would love for all of you to have a little bit of conversation with each other. We'll see how this goes. Jennifer did it beautifully, long distance. So let's try how to do this in the room. If all of you could turn to the person next to you and in pairs or threes, have this conversation. The question is, what first comes to mind when you hear the words Little Earth, printing press, and university? Little Earth, printing press, and university. And those online can do this on their own. What first comes to mind when you hear these words? Checking if everyone is done with their conversation. No audio. Oh, there, it's back. So checking again if everyone is done with their first thoughts. Can you hear me now? Not yet. Ah, there. Okay. All right. Oops. All right, everyone. I'm going to offer maybe Monisha this mic in case a couple of people just want to share what came up for them in their group. What came to mind when you talked about Little Earth, printing press, and university? Over there.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So nice to see you. Joel and I had a conversation about those 3 items, and we had different interpretations, of course. Joel is local, and I was here before, and I removed. So Without further ado, Joel, do you want to say what you thought first, and then I'll say mine?
Sure, yeah, thought about Little Earth, the reservation that's quite close to here, the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe people. I'm pretty impressed, thought about the mechanical, historical, kind of thing in university. I thought, knowledge.
And I thought of Little Earth as home. And then I thought of the printing press as marketing, loud, knowledge dissemination that's not necessarily truthful. And then the last piece, I thought university was politics and power and privilege. Thank you.
Anyone else? And then maybe we'll take something if someone shared all online after you.
Hello, everyone. I am Mong. And in our group of three, we discuss, although we have a little bit different viewpoint, but similar. Little Earth is precious. We do not have a planet B. So we all need to work to take care of it. Printing press is revolution. Revolution with people, ideas. It is not concentrated in one place coming from the Pope, but Martin Luther created this during this time, how connecting people. So we need to work together, and printing press is one that help. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything from the online world? Not at the moment. People are taking their time over coffees and teas. Okay, let's take one more. Is there someone there? Perfect. And then I will share what comes to mind for me.
Thank you. I just want to say that the university messed up the Little Press, the revolution. This is our reaction. And for Little Earth, for those of us who are very urban generations back, very European descended, I'm very sad to say I think I have lost it. I just don't have that connection with my Little Earth anymore, and it's very sad.
Yeah. What's your name? Sorry.
Pilar Mendoza from University of Missouri. Thank you.
Pilar Mendoza. Pilar, thank you. So let me just share what comes to mind for me at this moment in time. And the interesting thing about the invitation, what first comes to mind when you hear these words, is that there's no right or wrong answer to this, because it's all based on what we imagine or we think at a particular moment in our lives, at a particular moment in this ballroom. It's based on the narratives and stories we know and have heard. So there isn't a right or wrong, and yet what comes to mind first always has a bearing upon the narratives and stories we've been told. So it is interesting because of what Joel said, and because this is the first time I'm coming to Minneapolis. I did what nerdy Wikipedians do, which is read a lot. And I found that Little Earth is the United States' only Section 8 housing, specifically for Native American people. It's right here in Minneapolis. It's an urban space. And tragically, residents of Little Earth had encountered Derek Chauvin many years before he killed George Floyd in 2020, when he was involved in officer-involved shootings in Little Earth. So as Native American elders have talked about before and continue to, they are often canaries in very difficult coal mines. When I think of printing press, I think about the fact that Korea and China printed books much before Gutenberg's Bible in 1454. So China printed woodblock books from the 7th century CE on, and a metalloid type Buddhist doctrine was published in Korea in 1377. This image that you see is of the Diamond Sutra, which is the oldest existing printed book, printed in China in 834 CE. And then when I think of university at this moment in time to celebrate all the things we're celebrating, I think of the oldest university in the world as having been established as a mosque by a Muslim woman in Fez, Morocco, in the 9th century, right? How many of us knew that? There we go. Some narratives stick, some narratives never make it to the front page. I was lucky enough to glimpse a sight of it, you know, from the outside, because I'm not Muslim, but I was given a glimpse of it when I visited Fez a few years ago. So again, just recognizing there are no right or wrong answers, and yet we have deep narratives as teachers, as students, as lifelong learners. So I want to come back to Akka and come to why I do the work why we do the work we do. What are our contexts in which knowledge meets tech meets justice? And what are the contexts in which they don't? So starting with the injustices, a few years ago, our frenemies at Google did a projection, and they said that there are about 130 million books ever printed in mostly 480 languages. There are over 7,000 signed and spoken languages in the world. So if we take language as a proxy for knowledge, which I'm sure all of us in this room would, because many of us are bilingual or multilingual or have languages of expertise, we know that when we speak in English, we think differently, we do differently, we be differently than when we might speak in Bangla or in Arabic. And so thinking of language as a proxy for knowledge, 7% or so of the world's knowledge via language is in books. And so most of the world's knowledge is actually oral, it's visual, and it's embodied. It is not textual. And yet all of us who are academics or academic adjacent live in the world of text most of the time. So when we look at online websites, most online content is in English, with Russian a very trailing second. Most users come online in English or in Chinese, and most scholarly publications, surprise, are in English. 80% of all journals, 90% of social science journals, 80% of science journals that are indexed on Scopus and JSTOR are in English. If we look at our education system in the US and across the world, in 2018, of all full-time post-secondary faculty, you can see the figures, and they're not surprising to any of you. You all know this. 40% were white men, 35% white women, 7% Asian Pacific, 1% or less American Indian, Alaska Native, bi, or multiracial folks. And this is true across the world. I want to emphasize this because this is not true. I'm just using the US as an example since I'm sitting here or standing here with you. But in the UK, where I currently live, the land of my empire, a few years ago, there were only 25 Black women who were full professors out of 21,000. In India, where I'm from, and I still hold the passport, though they may take it away from me the more I talk about it. In the Indian Institutes of Technology and Management, some of our most elite educational institutions, only 6 to 9% of all faculty are Dalit, Bahujan. Bahujan are many castes and are considered again low caste in the pyramid of the caste system, and Adivasi, our First Nations or indigenous people, and even fewer, if at all, in positions of leadership. If you look at this community or these communities together, they make over 350 million people, more than the population of the United States. These are not minorities. They are the minoritized majority. So essentially, published and online knowledge, scholars and scholarship do not look, read, sound like the majority of us in the world. So what about digital infrastructures? You might be surprised to know that 60% of the world is now online. So most of those, 90% and more, are connected through mobile devices. So They're connected differently because access to the internet is different in different parts of the world. People understand what being digitally connected is different. Electricity and access to those basic forms of infrastructure are different, and yet over 60% of the world is now digitally connected. 3/4 of those connected are from the global south, from Asia and the Pacific Islands, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. 48% of all women are now online. Though, surprise again, men are 21% more likely to be online. And then if we look at who builds our network infrastructures, 5% of all leadership positions in the tech sector are held by women. In the US, women hold only 25% of computing roles. Of those, only 5% are Asian women, 3% are Black, 1% are Hispanic. And this is really terrible, unsurprisingly, as we have seen over the years at large big tech companies like Facebook, Apple, and Google. It continues in terms of our infrastructure. For those who don't know the ways that the internet operates, the internet is, I don't know, about 75,000 networks now globally connected through a socio-technical system. And we have different nonprofits and different consortiums that anchor the infrastructure, including the Internet Engineering Task Force and ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. They are the people who help us, who we pay when we get a .org domain name, for instance, right? As you can see, if you look at geography and gender of those involved, it is overwhelmingly North America and European based, overwhelmingly men. So the internet and its infrastructures do not look and sound like most of us in the world. So that brings me to then our frames. What are the frames that we at Whose Knowledge and many of our communities across the world, what are the frames that we use in order to resist these contexts? It brings me to the extraordinary Savitribai Phule. How many of you have ever heard of Savitribai Phule? I know at least 3 or 4 here who might. There, that's wonderful. That's more than many people in many rooms would. So it just shows what an amazing group you are. Thank you for giving me faith and hope. Sadly, even in India, most people do not know Savitribai because she was Dalit. So who we know and how we know them is so often an issue of power. Savitribai Phule was born in Maharashtra in 1831 to a Dalit Bahujan family, and she married Jyotirao Phule at the age of 9. He was 12 or 13. And together they became what you might today call the power couple of education. They established the first ever girls' school in India in 1848. She is considered the first woman teacher of modern India and the first modern radical poet in Marathi. And for her, liberation from the oppressions of caste, class, and gender were always through education in every possible sense. So this is a poem. I wish I could say it in Marathi. There are a few people here who might be able to, but I love this poem in so many ways for so many reasons, but sit idle no more, go get education, end the misery of the oppressed and forsaken. You've got a golden chance to learn, so learn and break the chains of caste. Throw away the Brahmin scriptures fast. And I want to just remind you that in India, with the caste system, the way it works was that knowledge was not allowed to those from the lower castes. So the Brahmins were the holders of education and knowledge, and no one was allowed to learn the scriptures other than them. And even worse, and even today, if you travel through India and you look at schools, Dalit Bahujan students are still, they are asked to sit on the margins of the classroom, sometimes outside. If a Dalit Bahujan teacher teaches, she's often boycotted. If a Dalit Bahujan person cooks the food is often thrown back at them. Caste is unfortunately still alive and well, and oppression is kicking and flourishing. So inspired by Savitribai, here are a few of our frames. We start with the radical knowledge that people are knowledges. Not books, not text, but people. And I'm interestingly going to use a dead white man to explain this. Michael Pollani, brother of Karl Pollani, for those who know him, was a Hungarian-British physical scientist. And he wrote about many different kinds of knowledge. And in his book, Tacit Knowledge, and in other works of his, he posited something very, very interesting and important. He talks about the fact that what I'm calling embodied knowledge or tacit knowledge is in all of us. What happens to make it disembodied or formal knowledge is the creation of an artifact. So the artifacts of knowledge, whether that is a book, a peer-reviewed journal article, a microfiche, a video, an audio that are archived, put into our libraries, put into our museums, those are artifacts of knowledge. And those artifacts have institutional authority. And of course, there's a recursive function here. It's a feedback loop. We learn from them, that we embody, and it goes back. But the fact that the creation of knowledge and the production of artifact is always grounded in power and privilege means that we need to stop and ask who has the power and privilege to create what forms of artifact. And that brings me to the feminist British philosopher, Miranda Fricker, who, takes all of the work of embodied experience that all of us have had across time and space and gives us a typology that we find very useful. The typology of epistemic injustice or knowledge injustice that she offers is between testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. So in testimonial injustice, the way she talks about it is, if you do not believe a person because of the community they come from, you do not believe their testimony, their word. Hermeneutical injustice is when you do not believe the concept that someone posits because you don't even recognize that concept in the cultural context you're in. So the two examples she gives us, for instance, are the police and a Black man on the streets of Minneapolis, or a woman in a context where sexual harassment is not even understood to be reality. Unfortunately, of course, those are both experiences that we still know. Savitribai experienced both forms as a Dalit woman. In fact, she had to carry an extra sari or extra clothes every time she went out to teach because upper caste folks would throw eggs or stones or cow dung at her. So she always carried an extra. So that then brings us to, with that anchoring in epistemic injustice and artifacts of knowledge, it brings us to our work at Who's Knowledge, which is to decolonize the internet. And I want to say this because decolonization has become one of those lovely, shiny words that we use a lot. And I want to ask us, with all humility, to use it very carefully. It is not a metaphor. It is a practice. It is about power. If we are not willing to understand what the histories of colonization have meant to all of us in the world and continue to mean, we cannot expect to decolonize. It is always a process. And so just as a reminder from my part of the world, what colonization did to us, because it was colonization of our resources, our bodies, our minds, of the possible futures we could have created. There's an economic anthropologist called Jason Hickel who says Britain didn't develop India, India developed Britain. And he bases his work on a feminist economist from India called Utsa Patnaik, who did work a few years ago and estimates that $45 trillion was siphoned out of India over 200 years. And so if you think about, how we think about colonization, it isn't that the resources that India is poor. India was made poor, right? And I'm often in the middle of London, I'm often said, but you know, the British gave you trains. And I have to turn around and say, well, you know why they had the trains? They had the trains not really because they wanted all of us to travel, but because they wanted to make sure they were transporting soldiers to places of mutiny and revolt and rebellion, right? There is a reason why life expectancy rose by 70% after the British were forced to leave India. So for all of us who have watched Black Panther, yes? Yes? Okay, just checking. Wakanda is not necessarily an Afro-future. It is a possible Afro-past because of the ways colonization have worked across the continent of Africa and across all of the global South. And I'm here also to remind us, for those of us who get cocky from the post-colonial nations of the global South, we continue to colonize our own people. So colonization is not over. And this forms of colonization then comes into the digital world. And that's why I do the work I do. That's why we do the work we do. That's why we're here to share practice. So just a reminder that colonial capitalist systems construct the notion of race in order to justify colonialism, right? The notions of race did not exist before then. And of course, once constructed, have significant emotional, psychological, material, and cognitive impacts on all of us. But those inequities then come into capitalism, because that's how we justify capitalism. They then come into tech capitalism and get reified and embedded into the internet. So the internet that we assume is this emancipatory, liberatory space could be that, and we'll talk a little bit about how it might be, but it cannot be till we examine the powers of history and privilege in which it is embedded. So that brings me to Ancestor Lorde and our principles. Audre Lorde gave us, I think, one of the most powerful understandings of political imagination that there is. Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet, born in New York City in 1938 to Caribbean immigrants. She has offered us some of the principles we believe in based on this radical sense of imagination. We center the leadership, design, and imaginations of the marginalized majority of the world in our work, or the minoritized majority, as we like to say. And I want to say this, that this is our definition of justice. Justice is when those who are most impacted by structures of power and privilege are at the heart of leadership, design, and imagination. Audre Lorde said, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies and eaten alive. And so one of the things she asks us to understand, and it is difficult for us to understand, but if this group cannot, I don't know who will, is that the imaginations that have brought us to the world we live in today are not the imaginations that will lead us out of it. So we have to stand in allyship, in solidarity with each other, but we have to look for the imaginations of those whose worldviews, whose future dreaming has not been understood or listened to so far. Audre Lorde's dreams, for instance. And that will bring us joy, it will bring us hope, and it will bring us transformation. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, the Maori scholar from Aotearoa, New Zealand, brings resistance, liberation, and imagination together by saying that we need to remake ourselves. And she, in this extraordinary book, Decolonizing Methodologies, that I'd recommend to any of you, says research is the dirtiest word in the indigenous vocabulary. And then she talks about how research can be remade with power. So we are rooted in an intersectional power analysis, And that means for us that we, I'm going to describe it strangely, but we wear discomfort like a second skin. And the reason I say that is discomfort is different from dread. If we are in places of dread, we need to be careful. But discomfort can be creative, it can be honest. And therefore, the minute we feel discomfort, it's telling us something important. And so we remind ourselves that even as a collective of Black and brown women from and in the global South, we have to constantly question our own positions. We ask ourselves these questions of power all the time. So I don't want to belabor this because all of you understand power, but just to remind us that we have to keep asking these questions of ourselves. There's no forgetting these questions, and there's no assuming we have arrived at being just and equitable. So all of these are part of the questions that we ask ourselves. And I'll pause for a minute here to say that it is particularly important for those of us who are in education to keep asking who is the storyteller and curator. We often forget in tech to ask who is the curator, because we will say, we will ask who is the storyteller, but not often who's the curator. And the curator has significant power, as we know. And whose design, imagination, and leadership? Whose expertise? Who do we consider an expert? And of course, it's dynamic, it's intersectional. I've already used my own example to show you we are simultaneously many people. But I think that's really important to remember. It's also a way in which for us to be challenging of ourselves and each other, but compassionate at the same time. We are in a moment in history in which we are having conversations we have never had before. And we don't know the answers. We don't know the language. We don't have the vocabulary. So even as we sit with rage, with anger, all of which is understandable, we sit with challenge, which is needed. We also need to sit with wrathful compassion, as the Buddhists say. And we recognize that knowledge justice is about reparations. It is not about representation and solutionism. You can't just add women and stir. You can't just add the global South and stir, right? We all know what that does. And it is really important for us to recognize, therefore, the responsibility we have in being transformative and not seeing representation as enough. It is necessary, but insufficient. We celebrate difference. We don't see it as a cause of division or of fear. And Audre Lorde said this the best, so I'm just going to use her words. Difference must not be merely tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic. Only then does the necessity for interdependency become unthreatening. Only within that interdependency of different strengths, acknowledged and equal, can the power to seek new ways of being in the world generate, as well as the courage and sustenance to act where there are no charters. Within the interdependence of mutual non-dominant differences lies that security which enables us to descend into the chaos of knowledge and return with true visions of our future. Difference is that raw and powerful connection from which our personal power is forged. And then finally, a really important principle, we don't see the global the way big tech seeks the global. We see it as translocal, not as Silicon Valley. One of the things that big tech tends to assume is that what it does is global, when its imaginations and leadership are so narrowly confined to Silicon Valley. And all of us as teachers, as learners, we should do our best not to fall into that trap as well. There is no one view of the world that is global. It is situated knowledge and it is perspectives from everywhere. So here's where I wanted to spend most time, and I'm just looking at the clock and making sure you're not bored. So holler if you are. But I wanted to spend the most time in practice. because I think this is, as I said, intention meets honesty, and to tell you a little bit of what we do to be in practice around these principles. And again, bell hooks anchors us in this, because bell hooks says it best around love and around practice. I'm still in mourning, as I'm sure many of us are, at her early passing a few months ago. She was born in 1952 in Kentucky to a working class Caribbean immigrant family. And her form of love is not pink candy floss. It's fierce love, it's transformative love, and it's a love that demonstrates its power and honesty through practice. Practice was really important for her. She talks in Transgression as Freedom, she talks about praxis. And someone mentioned Paulo Freire yesterday, but her conversations with Freire were really important to her. And so for us, in everything we do, our organizing practices are love, respect, and solidarity. In all the ways that we work, we do our best to work out of a place of love, respect, and solidarity, because there can be no love without justice. And the moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. And so at Whose Knowledge, the way we think about our work is like a multi-burner stove. I learned this wonderful way of thinking about strategy from an Indian woman activist many years ago when I was a very young kid, probably around the age that Supriya and I met, since she brought it up. We think about the fact that when we're trying to do transformative work, we can't do everything at once. We all need different energies at different moments in time. So it's like creating a full meal. You have different pots on the stove, and the best meal is when you know exactly when to turn the heat up on one pot and when to put the other on simmer, and to know the difference till you get your delicious meal. So this is how we think about knowledge justice, folks, a multi-burner stove. Some of the pots that are on our stove right now are Wikipedia, which I'm sure all of you have thoughts about, so I'd love to hear more. Languages and multilinguality. Archives, oral and visual, community-led radical archives, and internet design and architecture, because for us, we enter the debate around digital tech through content. But the internet is many things. It's at the back end, it's about design and architecture. And at the front end, it's about user experience. How do we even use our laptops? But in the middle is all this stuff around content, what we get when we access the internet. So very quickly, how we do what we do is as important or more than what we do. And we work with communities deeply across time. We work very carefully at the rhythms of their needs and at the rhythms of their work rather than ours, which, as we all know, is not easy, but it is the only way to start a respectful relationship. And the care and trust and love that we share is, I think, incredibly powerful. For me, particularly, it's been an act of great joy and privilege and pain to work with the Dalit Bahujan feminist communities, because as a Savarna, I understand that this is my responsibility. We have also worked with queer Bosnians. We have worked with Native American folks in Southern California and in Nevada, the Shoshone and the Kumeyaay. And we collaboratively write together, because this is the way we break the portals of academia. We write together, we speak together when we can, and our work is always in the collective. So for those who can, because all of you can get the paywalled journal article, that's one in IFJP called Centering Knowledges from the Margins. But here's one that you can get on our website that we are very proud of, and it's called Our Stories, Our Knowledges. And it looks at how decolonizing what decolonizing means in each of their contexts. So de-Brahmanizing for the Dalit Bahujan, queering for the Bosnians, and unsettling for the Kumeyaay and the Shoshone. And in that process, it's a set of resources. They talk about what they have done to bring their knowledges online. What are the tools they've used? What are the challenges they've had? And what are the opportunities and joys they have felt? And the last resource in that set is called How to Ally and Be a Good Guest, which we all thought we needed for each other. But if you're interested more in this practice, please have a look at it. As I said before, our archives work is across different community archives, different radical people-led archives. Dalit History Month, which I mentioned before, is April, and we're working with Dalit feminists right now to support their work and bring their knowledges online. And then there's Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is the best of the internet in many ways, right? It's among the top 20 websites. It is not proprietary. It does not have ads. It is community sourced. I'm a Wikipedian, so I'm going to confess that straight away. And I'm going to say that as a Wikipedian, I come to my community with what I call tough love. And as whose knowledge, the tough love we offer is to recognize that Wikipedia may be the best of the internet, but it's not yet the best of humanity. So it's the largest knowledge project in history. There are over 300 language Wikipedias. Many people visit it every day and every month, and yet only 10% of all Wikipedia editors are estimated to be women or non-binary folks. Only about 20% of public knowledge is produced on or by people from the Global South. And of course, it matters because it gets taken up by third-party content providers. So when you look up something on Google, what gets pulled up most often is something from Wikipedia. So the inequities in Wikipedia travel across the internet. And I'm not going to belabor this, but just very quickly, in 2012, our friends at Oxford Internet Institute did some data visualization and found that there were more articles within this tiny circle of Western Europe than in the rest of the world. And then they did this again in 2018. It's a little better with a lot of work, but still a long way to go. Look at the dark places, as always. And this is true for gender as well. And of course, intersectionally, gender and other forms of oppression. But most of the biographies on Wikipedia are of men. Only a quarter are of women. Of that quarter, only a quarter have images. So the invisibility of women, and of course, then the invisibility of Black and brown women and those from the Global South, of queer women, is immense. So we run a campaign called Visible Wiki Women. You can see our happy little sticker there. And Visible Wiki Women is to bring the images of notable women from around the world onto Wikipedia. So if after this, the one thing you do is take a picture of each other because you're all notable in your ways, and educationists are always welcome on Wikipedia biographies, that will be an action you've done. So I welcome that. We've also been looking at structured data, because this is the work that most people don't see and don't recognize. Structured data is the little tiny bits of information that are machine readable, that a machine can process. And it is the way in which most of the platforms and apps that we use understand our queries and what we do on those platforms and apps. And yet, structured data, you see the word structure in it, is based on typologies, ontologies, and epistemologies of classification. Whose ontology? Whose epistemology? Whose classifications, right? And so we had a conversation in which my friend Paz from Chile said beautifully, why do we assume that data floats? It floats free from their origins. They are stripped from our bodies, from our history, and therefore they are free to navigate the world like a neutral currency, a universal currency. And as she says, that's a historical continuation of these forms of Eurocentrism and colonization. And then my favorite piece of work right now, which is we have just launched our multilingual report on multilinguality on the internet, and have done it with over 100 people from around the world in different languages. And we did this as research action. So we found that only about 500 of us 7,000 spoken and signed languages are represented on the internet. Most people have to reach for their nearest dominant language or their nearest European colonial language to access the internet. So either Arabic or Mandarin Chinese, or English, Spanish, Portuguese, French. And so we are working together with techies and activists and scholars and linguists and educationists from around the world to make this different. Because if our content is not multilingual, then our content is not multi-knowledge. And so that is where, well, I wanted actually, let's just do this very quickly if you permit me, because I know some of you have to go, but just a quick video which brings these different voices and languages into the room for us to celebrate. My friend Robert is going to do that for us. Thank you, Robert.
Relatório do estado dos idiomas na internet.
Informe sobre el estado de las lenguas en internet.
The state of the internet's languages.
بالنسبة للدراسة اللي تمت على
find myself as a queer individual. আমি একজন নিজেকে queer মানুষ বলে মনে করি। আমি
In particular, we have been considering how indigenous peoples from across and beyond Turtle Island, colonially called Canada, the United States.
Relatório do estado dos idiomas
Informe sobre el estado de las lenguas en internet.
The state of the internet's languages.
You know where you can go now. Thank you, Robert. And thank you for being here, for listening to me. Once again, a reminder that hope and joy in this continuum between idealism and cynicism is in the collective, in solidarity with each other, in knowing that we stand together, we walk together, and we work together in our shared liberations. That is our collective and connected joy. Without community, there is no liberation, as Audre Lorde reminded us. And as Savitribai Phule said, awake, arise and educate, smash traditions and liberate. Thank you.
Isn't she awesome? So we don't have a lot of time. So what I would like to do is maybe take 2 questions from the room, 1 from Zoom, just collect them and have you respond, and then invite everyone in the name of internet activism, post your questions on Twitter with our hashtag CIES 2022, and maybe we can have a little Twitter chat about some of the provocations here, and come to the 1:30 provocation session. There'll be dessert and iced tea, and we can have some more conversation at 1:30 in that room down the hall there. Great. So that might be a way to continue the conversation because we're short on time. But do we have 2 quick questions from the room? Anybody would like to share? And then we can take one from our Zoom folks as well. Yes. Introduce yourself too.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. My name is Zina Zakharia. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland. I've been reading a little bit about artificial intelligence as the new form of colonialism, and I wondered how, if you could speak a little bit on that and help us to be more aware of how these things that we're not conscious of are playing a role to reinforce some of the things you've been talking about.
Thank you, Zina. Another question from the room? Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Limbani Sapato. I'm from Malawi. It was really a good case that you brought to us. I think one issue that is coming out is the digital divide. And I wanted to hear, in your view, what should be done to address this digital divide? Thank you.
It's more of a comment from the internet here. Somebody commented and said, would it be interesting to know how many within that 25% of women are from the BIPOC population, if you have any info about it?
So I think we'll leave you with 3 minutes to wrap up.
Sure,
the last word.
I'll do AI in like 5 seconds, you know. Thank you all for those questions. Zina, it's a really important question. And I just want to say, I hate the phrase artificial intelligence. Many of us who are activists in the space hate it because it assumes intelligence. And one of the interesting things that Indigenous elders remind us, again, not to construct a monolithic notion of indigeneity, many 6,000 indigenous nations in the world. But we are the youngest species in the world. And in indigenous epistemologies, they never offer, there is no relationship of life to anything that humans build. Nothing that humans create has a relationship. The relationships are all to other forms of sentience, to all the older species, the trees, the plants, the animals. So the fact that we call machines artificial intelligence, or we have a sense of intelligence, is itself such a problematic term. So machine learning systems, augmented, automated systems, all have at the core of them 2 or 3 really important problems. One is that, as we've already said, who designs these systems has an impact on how they are designed, right? So of course, if you are a proprietary platform like Google, where you're vacuuming up our data, or Facebook that is vacuuming up our data, then what we're doing is constructing machine learning out of algorithms, out of math. A wonderful critic called Cathy O'Neill writes a brilliant book called Weapons of Math Destruction, which has to be the most wonderful title of a book ever. Please read it. It's math. And so depending on how you use math, how you construct that algorithm, you are going to have biased, problematic data coming out at the other end, right? So even the learning that it does is going to be problematic. Then the data sets that are being used are data sets from all of us and all of our many biases and problematic politics, and whose data and whose knowledge is known and unknown, right? And so, for instance, Microsoft had a bot called Tay a few years ago. It was a very hastily removed experiment, because Tay, in the course of hours, she was an automated bot on Twitter, within the course of hours became racist, homophobic, patriarchal, and every possible form of oppression, because that was what the data sets that Tay had been designed on and was being taught on reflected. The problem, though, is that we can't say then, all we have to do is change the data sets, right? Because that is often where engineers in big tech stop. What is being asked of us, I think, and what many of my friends and colleagues in this work do, is to talk about how do we create connected but sovereign data sets governed by the communities from which they come from. We need power over our own data. How do we do that? And then how do we, with positions of agency, then reflect in the ways in which tech can create a connective tissue that allows us to do some of the machine learning that are actually potentially just and equitable and useful for us. So that's one 5-second answer. In terms of the digital divide, is it Lynn? I'm sorry if I missed your name. In fact, I'm sitting with a very beautiful essay from Malawi on Chindali and access. And in fact, that essay from a contributor called Donald to our State of the Internet's Languages report talks about this, which is that what is the use of talking about the internet when so many of us don't even have access to phones? And then when we have access to phones, we don't have data plans. We don't have the money for those data plans. And so it is true, 40% of the world is not digitally connected, and it's not digitally connected because of the lack of access to resources. And so I think part of our work is to remember that when we talk about knowledge justice and we are in the digital sphere, not to forget those who are not in the digital sphere, but still influenced by it. Right? And at the same time, to not imagine that the only way forward is for all of us to be digitally connected. There is a possible counterfactual history or future in which we say we should be less digitally connected, which some of us, in fact, already try and do in our everydays. So there are two things I think we have to do. We have to give access to resources to those who want them and need them, right? And that is part of the work that we have to do as communities, as governments, as corporations. But really, if we're looking at transformation, we have to recognize that so much of the digital divide is in the divide of the everyday colonial capitalist systems we're in. The fact that we do not understand labor, the fact that we don't even look at the labor that supports us in our everyday, let alone the labor that is part of artificial intelligence and content moderation systems online, the fact that our continents are so denuded that our own governments are not able to give us the resources we need, come from these histories, and we have to recognize them. But we also have to work towards offering those resources. So it's not an easy answer, but I think those of us who are educationists need to recognize that even in the world we live in, there's such a great difference between how people are digitally connected. Your one student may be completely differently digitally connected than your other student, and recognizing that is our duty of care. And then finally, in terms of the data, it's an excellent question, and it's actually something we're trying to work on right now. It's a non-trivial problem, I can tell you that, to actually understand exactly how that happens because of the way Wikipedia categorizes their community-led categorizations. So if people don't categorize, we don't know. So we actually have to do a lot of sort of back-end work, but it is one of the things that we work on. And a sub-focus of our Visible Wiki Women campaign is called Women of Colors, for exactly that reason. So join our Women of Colors.
Thank you so much. Honestly, both Monisha and I are sort of fighting like, oh, you know, like we just not fighting, but we're both like, we both want to say thank you to you. And we want to say thank you to all. We hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very, very much for bringing so many important things to our attention and doing it in a way that shares sort of who you are and your spirit and your generosity and all of those good things. One more little pearl in the journey of knowing Anasuya. So thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming and for these brilliant provocations, insights, enriching our conversations in so many ways that we will continue to have through the rest of the conference and in our work. And Supriya did say that this session will be recorded. I know I'll be sharing it with my students, and I think we can keep learning from this conversation online, through Twitter conversations, through the next session, and keep thinking about these difficult and important questions. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you all at the next session.